So how does endochondral ossification occur? So here is our slab of hyaline cartilage. Okay, we'd have chondrocytes and their lacunae all throughout here, embedded in a bunch of hyaline cartilage extracellular matrix. We have perichondrium that surrounds it. Remember, perichondrium is connective tissue that supplies the vasculature and nervous supply to the hyaline cartilage. All right, so what happens, there are certain chemical cues that happen in the developing fetus, and those chemical cues are going to stimulate the cells, the chondroblast, right? Because we're still talking about cartilage here. The chondroblast in the perichondrium to switch and become osteoblast, all right? So chondroblast in the perichondrium will receive chemical signals from the developing fetus and then differentiate or switch to osteoblast. And then what do osteoblasts do? They start secreting osteoid. That becomes calcified. And so what we have, the first major event of endochondral ossification is the formation of this bone collar. The chondroblasts differentiate into osteoblast, and then over time this perichondrium switches over to a developing periosteum, right? And we form that bone collar. Now the osteoblasts that are in this bone collar continue to secrete the extracellular matrix of the developing bone. This calcifies the cartilage, right? So the cartilage in here starts to calcify. The chondrocytes that are located in the cartilage aren't specialized to be able to deal with calcified cartilage, and they're cut off because of this bone collar. They're cut off from the blood supply, and so they start to die, right? So that's the first major event that happens in endochondral ossification. Chemical cues trigger chondroblasts to differentiate into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts will start to secrete essentially bone, forming a bone collar. The perichondrium switches to a periosteum. The cartilage becomes calcified. The bone collar and the calcified cartilage together kill the chondrocytes because they get cut off from the nutrient supply from the blood vessels. Okay. The next major event is that we'll have blood vessels that will innervate. So in this bone collar, there are not only osteoblasts that are present, but some of the cells will develop into osteoclasts as well. And if you remember what osteoclasts are, they're the cells that degrade or resorb bone, right? So they break down bone. Osteoclasts will carve out a hole in the bone collar, allowing for blood vessels to now innervate the portion that will eventually become the diaphysis. And this is our primary ossification center. So osteoclasts carve a hole in the bone collar, blood vessels enter, forming the primary ossification center. Okay? These blood vessels are going to bring nutrients, but they also bring bone cells like osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Well, osteoblasts are going to start laying down bone around these blood vessels, so we see spongy bone forming in what will eventually become the diaphysis. What do the osteoclasts do? The osteoclast will start to carve away the majority of that spongy bone, forming the medullary cavity in what will eventually become the diaphysis. All right? So that calcified cartilage gets replaced by bone. Okay, those osteoblasts that are brought in by these blood vessels lay down bone around the blood vessels, forming spongy bone. Osteoclasts carve away the spongy bone, forming the medullary cavity. While this is happening, blood vessels will innervate the ends of the hyaline cartilage model. These ends will eventually become the epiphyses. Okay, and the blood vessels that innervate at the epiphyses, at the ends, okay, those blood vessels also bring bone cells like osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And these sites are called the secondary ossification centers. So the primary ossification center is in what will eventually become the diaphysis. The secondary ossification centers are at the ends of this model that will eventually become the epiphyses. All right, so osteoblasts will start to lay down bone around these blood vessels, forming this spongy bone. All right. And then over time, over the course of endochondral ossification, what we are left with is what it's showing here is a long bone where we have a long, slender diaphysis with a carved out medullary cavity, and then epiphyses that are filled with spongy bone and compact bone around the periphery. All right. Now we do have some hyaline cartilage that's left over. That hyaline cartilage, so everything pretty much gets replaced with bone except for the epiphyseal plates. And remember, epiphyseal plates are lines of hyaline cartilage between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So we have an epiphyseal plate here, an epiphyseal plate here. Those epiphyseal plates are remnants of the hyaline cartilage that we started with. And the other remnants of the hyaline cartilage that we started with is the articular cartilage. And remember, articular cartilage is hyaline cartilage that surrounds the epiphysis. Why does it surround the epiphyses? Because long bones will articulate with or form a joint with another bone at these epiphyses, right? So this, remember I talked about that. It was one of the things that I had forgotten, but I went back and added it to one of the next video. So the articular cartilage that surrounds the epiphyses and the epiphyseal plates are the remnants of the hyaline cartilage that we started with. Everything else gets replaced with bone. So the cartilage only remains in the epiphyseal plates and on the articular surfaces, which we just talked about. Articular cartilage persists into adulthood. The reason why articular cartilage persists, and now it won't be the same exact hyaline cartilage with the same exact chondrocytes that you had during fetal development. There is the hyaline cartilage will somewhat remodel over time as well. But the articular cartilage will persist, and that's because those long bones, those bones will always form joints. Okay? The epiphyseal plates, however, are eventually replaced with bone once growth in length ceases. So what that means is, so the epiphyses are always going to form joints. So articular cartilage, or the hyaline cartilage around the epiphyses, is always required. Whereas you stop growing in height at a certain point. So, because we just can't continue to grow taller and taller and taller and taller and taller over time. So the epiphyseal plates, which is where lengthening of long bones occurs, the epiphyseal plate will eventually be replaced with bone once growth and length cease or stops. Okay. Let's see. Some of the bones that are the last to ossify are the bones, the carpal bones of your wrist. And this is just an image from your book showing you that. So a young child has an x-ray of their hand, and there are 8 carpal bones, but you can barely see them here. And the reason, when you take an x-ray, any soft tissues, like softer tissues, will not show up on an x-ray, whereas bones do. They absorb the x-rays and they're very prominent on x-ray film. So here, it looks like there are no bones of the wrist. There are no carpal bones, but they just haven't completely ossified yet. Whereas this is an x-ray of a hand of an adult, and now we can see those prominent carpal bones. So this is just demonstrating that the carpal bones are some of the last bones to completely ossify. And I think that so endochondral ossification begins in the fetal stage of development for most bones. Some bones, like of the wrist and ankle, ossify much, much later. Okay. And then this, if you want to read about osteoporosis versus healthy bone, this is showing you an image of healthy spongy bone. And then over here is spongy bone that has over time been impaired because of osteoporosis. Porosis meaning, so yes, there are these pores in healthy spongy bone where you would find red bone marrow, but if you look at the trabeculae, right, that you see even pores within that because those have been formed because of a disease state. Causes of osteoporosis, there are lots of causes, like dietary, so just not having enough calcium and or not having enough vitamin D. Remember, vitamin D, you need vitamin D to absorb calcium. If you don't have vitamin D, you can take in calcium all day long, but your intestines won't absorb it. So you have to have both vitamin D in your diet, or you have to have, remember, those keratinocytes that produce vitamin D, and you have to have some UV radiation to kind of activate that vitamin D. If you don't get enough UV or the right amount, the appropriate amount of UV exposure, then this vitamin D doesn't become activated. So you have to take in vitamin D through your diet, right? This is chapter 5 stuff being linked into chapter 6 stuff. So understanding how these systems are linked is important. And I may ask a question about vitamin D that brings in information you learned from both chapter 5 as well as chapter 6, okay? Female gender, so that has to do a lot with the lack of estrogen. So in postmenopausal women, it's common for them to develop osteoporosis. That's because estrogen, you'll see in the next section that hormones have an effect on ossification of bone and maintaining bone. And then once menopause hits in an older female, the estrogen just completely drops and you no longer have that hormonal effect to maintain ossified bone. There are genetic factors and other diseases. The lack of exercise thing means if you are too sedentary and you don't do any exercise, there's not enough. It's good and healthy for your bones to experience some tension and some forces pulling on it because it triggers those bones to become stronger. So if you're completely bedridden or if you don't exercise at all, then your bones aren't getting tension applied to them and forces applied to them. They're not having to bear any weight really. And so it's like, oh, well, I don't have to be super strong because I'm not being used, right? Okay, so if you want to read more about, I'm not going to ask about diagnosis or prevention, but if you want to read through this, it gives you just a clinical application of what you're learning in chapter 6.